Okay, this is a continuation of Chapter 2 for the American Government course. We're going to be talking specifically in this section of how the framers sold the Constitution to the states. Most particularly, we'll be looking at a couple of the Federalist Papers, which were written predominantly by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. We'll also look at a little bit more detail on the Bill of Rights, which were promised by the framers in order to get it ratified. And then we'll also look a little bit more specifically at the separation of powers between the three branches of government, which was a very important aspect of the Constitution, which would keep federal government from becoming too powerful. So let's talk about the Federalist Papers, two of them in particular. And Federalist Paper number 10 and Federalist Paper number 51 are both in the back of the textbook in the appendix. Should have read them by now. They are both relatively short. Both of those are written by James Madison. Federalist Paper number 10 is perhaps considered one of the greatest documents in American history as to how it explained the rationale behind the Constitution's representative republic. You could argue, as we've said before, that the Federalist Paper number 10 could also represent something of a culmination of Enlightenment thinking over the past couple of hundred years in order to try to channel man's self-interests into the public good. And Madison was talking about, particularly in Federalist Paper number 10, about the violence of factions. And faction, as we said before, is a group of people that come together over some common impulse or passion, and it has the potential to get unruly, grow bigger into mob rule, tyranny of the majority, things like that. But we're also recognizing that it's human nature for us to want to group together with other people that think like us and look like us. That's kind of what makes us humans. We evolved over couple million years or so in small groups, hunter-gatherers. So that's in our nature to do that. We could either remove the causes of factions or control the effects of the factions. And so what we acknowledge here is that the first remedy, in order to remove the ability for people to group together, that would be even worse than the factions themselves. What we're going to try to do with this representative republic is to control the effects of faction, to temper the potential violence of factions by filtering them through this representation system. And again, we're talking about the prospect of the tyranny of majority through this, trying to use this system to prevent these insurrections, mob rules to grow out of proportion. Madison, which is also kind of a continuation of the Enlightenment thinking, is that the pure democracy is not really practical, to have every single person have a say in what government policy is going to be. We'll touch on that a little bit more as we go through the course, that pure democracy is not the cure. So what we're looking for here is a republic where we're going to refine public views by passing them through our medium of a chosen body, our representation system, where states are divided up into districts that elect a representative to go to Congress, and each state has 2 senators which go to represent them in the Senate. So the Republic, he was using quite a bit of research and knowledge that had come well before him, whether you want to talk about Condorcet, Voltaire, Rousseau. We've already talked about John Locke, Montesquieu, among others. But using this representative republic, we're more likely to center on men with the most attractive merit and character. That's the intent anyway, that we're going to elect people with enlightened views that are superior to local prejudices. So therefore, factious leaders will be unable to kind of spread their flame or this spread the conflagration, since we're going to be refining those views through representatives to Congress. Federalist Paper number 51 pretty much outlines the rationale behind the separation of powers, which we'll talk about at the end of this section. Each department is going to have its own will. And this is a famous quote from Federalist number 51. Ambition must be made to counter ambition. So each of the three branches, we're talking about the executive branch led by the president, the legislative branch led by Congress, which makes the laws, and the judicial branch, which is the courts, which interprets the laws. Each of those branches will have its own motivations, its own self-interest to keep the other in check. And this was, again, influenced by Montesquieu's writings on separation of powers, and it has worked relatively well. Madison kind of discusses what in this Republican government, the legislative authority, i.e. the Congress, would necessarily predominate because they are making the laws. But what they also decided to do, since the Congress is going to be the lawmaking branch and would necessarily predominate, they're going to divide it into two houses called bicameralism. They divide it into a House of Representatives and the Senate. So they would have to agree on the bills before they go to the president to be signed. Again, another separation of power there. So the branches will control each other at the same time controlled by itself. So in a very diverse society, which is what was expected, we were going to have a large territory, a large population, and a diverse society. This representative republic, this separation of power, was going to work well for what was expected in the United States, and that the rights of the individual or the minority would be in less danger from combinations of the majority. Madison's prescriptions have worked out pretty well when you look how successful the United States has been, relatively speaking, and how influential this Constitution has been to all the other democratic countries in the world. Now, as I've talked about before, the Bill of Rights were promised. Originally, Madison and his cohorts there at the Constitutional Convention did not feel the need to put a Bill of Rights into the Constitution because each state would have its own Bill of Rights. In order to get the Anti-Federalists in particular on board, the Bill of Rights was promised because Anti-Federalists were against the idea of having a stronger federal government in the first place. They were the ones that wanted to maintain their own self-interests and their own state powers and did not want another layer of government that they would have to report to. So the Bill of Rights were promised in order to provide clearer and more restrictive boundaries on the national government. So they were submitted immediately in Congress in 1789, and they were ratified by December 1791. So what I want to do for the next few minutes here is let's actually go through each of the first 10 amendments. So First Amendment is a heavyweight. There's 5 rights that are actually talked about in the First Amendment here. Freedom of religion, and that also includes the freedom from the government, or the protection from the government of establishing a religion. We also have freedom of speech. We've got freedom of the press. We've got the right to assemble, and we have the right to petition. The petitions were very useful in the colonies in order to try to get policy passed so people could, express what they thought needed to be done to address their grievances. The Second Amendment, the well-regulated militia, is somewhat of an anachronism now since we don't really have a militia. The United States in particular, at the beginning, was opposed to a standing army. So that's why a militia which means the people would be at the ready, that if anything happened, call out the militia, people would come and protect as needed. And in order, to, of course, to be in the militia, you had to have a weapon, have a gun. And so that's where the right to keep and bear arms is somewhat specific to the United States because of our opposition to a standing army and to have a militia. So now the Second Amendment, of course, is very controversial, and it's in that we have so much gun violence in the United States, much like the freedom of speech, where there are several restrictions on what you can not say. There's several things that you cannot do, despite the fact that we have freedom of speech. Well, then there's also going to be necessary restrictions on bearing arms as we get into a more populated, complicated society. The Third Amendment is also somewhat irrelevant in today's world. That was to prevent the quartering of soldiers, and that was a big issue in the colonies there, particularly as in our run up to the Revolution. There was a big sore spot to have to quarter British soldiers. At that time, that was something that they were very sensitive to, so they put it in the Bill of Rights that would not, the government would not require people to quarter soldiers. Now, the Fourth Amendment is very important to prevent unreasonable searches and seizures. This has also been bolstered somewhat in the court system over the years, to where we'll hit on these a little bit more with our evolution of civil rights in Chapter 4. But if the government does not have a search warrant and obtains evidence and it goes to trial, well, then that evidence could actually get thrown out of court. So that's what's called the exclusionary rule, which the Supreme Court has bolstered this Fourth Amendment somewhat as well. Now, the Fifth Amendment is another biggie. There's at least 5 aspects of the Fifth Amendment worth talking about. The grand jury is required for federal capital crimes, to where a jury convenes and they will determine whether or not there's enough evidence to indict somebody for a crime. And those are not required in all of the states. Some states do have grand juries, but the federal government requires a grand jury indictment. There is also double jeopardy rule, where somebody cannot be charged or convicted of the same crime twice, because that would prevent government from harassing somebody. Well, we charged that person and then he was found not guilty, so let's find some more evidence and charge him again until we get him in jail. So that's why it's a pretty big deal for prosecuting attorneys to be very confident that they've got all the evidence they need to get a conviction, because as they say, you may have heard this on true crime shows, is that they only get one bite of the apple. If they do not convict that person, they can't go after them again. Also, we see the right to remain silent, which is what is said right here, that no one can be compelled to be a witness against themselves. So that's where you can plead the Fifth or right to remain silent. That's in the Fifth Amendment. We also have, that's also been bolstered over the years as well, where the Supreme Court has even ruled that the government has to inform the person that they have the right to remain silent. Now, due process of law is another aspect of this. This is somewhat of a reiteration of the right of habeas corpus that we've already talked about. You're guaranteed due process of the law, so that the government cannot unfairly go after somebody or deprive them of their full process of determining guilt or innocence. And then the last part of the Fifth Amendment is what we call eminent domain, where private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. And this is, still controversial in today's world, where the government will occasionally need to take something for a public highway or some sort of public utility, and they will negotiate with people. Some people may not be willing to negotiate or not feel like that they're getting fair compensation, but so that is somewhat of a give and take process. Now let's go to the Sixth Amendment, which has a couple of very important parts. Is that first one is that there's a right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury. So that's written in the Constitution. Now, speedy, of course, is somewhat ironic in today's world where it may be difficult to get a speedy trial with all the crowded court dockets that we have in the United States. And sometimes you might even need a little bit more time to prepare for your defense. But that right is in there. Talk a little bit here about the right to have assistance of counsel for your defense. And that's also in the Sixth Amendment. And that was also bolstered a little bit by the Supreme Court that had a ruling in the 1960s that said that if you cannot afford a defense, then the state will provide one for you. This is through the public defender's office. Yeah, even though it says you have the right for an assistance of counsel in the Constitution, well, for many years people could not afford that. So then the state will provide that for you as part of that evolution of our civil rights and civil liberties. The Seventh Amendment is pretty much just confirming the right to a trial by jury for civil crimes. Now we'll talk a little bit more about civil crimes. Those are where no intentional crime has been committed, but there's a disagreement, particularly over a contract or over services rendered or not rendered, or negligence or malfeasance or things like that. So we'll talk more in detail about civil law when we get into that particular chapter on the courts. The Eighth Amendment is talking about where excessive bail shall not be required. Bail allows for somebody who's accused of a crime to post bond to be able to go out and still live their life and do their job and help prepare in their defense. Some countries don't even have bail. Now, of course, there is some discretion there, because if someone who's accused of a very serious crime and may be a danger to society, the bail may be revoked, or it may be just so high that it could not be attained. But judges are kind of held to certain rules, but there are certain exceptions there. And the excessive fines, that's actually one that was in the courts this past year, to where some states were taking more property than what the crime was worth. And so that is something that states still have to keep an eye on. The Eighth Amendment also talks about no cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. The death penalty has come under scrutiny a couple of times that we'll talk about as far as our evolution of civil rights and civil liberties is concerned. But we still have the death penalty in the United States. There's still a slight majority that approves of the death penalty, even though there's only a handful of states that actually still use the death penalty. But whether the death penalty is at issue or not, obviously torture and things like that are clearly out of bounds as far as cruel and unusual punishment goes. Now, the Ninth Amendment is the one that's fairly vague, called the enumeration of certain rights that are not mentioned. That's what we're talking about here, is that just because it's not in the Constitution, there are certain rights that could be recognized, particularly in today's world. The right to privacy, that's the one that has been used quite a bit, particularly your right to your own property, the right, even the right to an abortion was determined somewhat of a right to a woman's privacy, to her own bodies. There's other issues. We have so much data on our cell phones that now there's been a Supreme Court case that says that government has to have a search warrant to look at your smartphone. So society is still evolving, and the right to privacy is one that's going to be invoked quite a bit. The rights of the disabled, that's another one that has been brought up, and of course, a fairly controversial issue that's becoming more, I guess you could say, prevalent in some countries, in a few states, is the right to assisted suicide. And so those some other rights that could come up that could be addressed in the Ninth Amendment. Now, the 10th Amendment is very short and sweet, but this is a very important amendment. This is one thing that really the states were waiting to hear for the most part, is that any powers that are not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution or prohibited by the states are thereby reserved to the states or to the people. So this is what we call the Reserved Powers Clause, and it's extremely important enough that we will go back and look at that a little bit more in detail. The 10th Amendment, the Reserved Powers Clause. So this is talking about in our federalist system where we have a central government that operates separately from the state governments. Well, the federal government then has to delegate quite a few things down to the states. Over the years, these have been categorized into three primary powers. One, of course, is called police power, and that's all of your criminal statutes that you need for your state, whether it's criminal codes, safety regulations, labor standards, things like that. Those are all left up to the state to take care of. Home rule is to where each state is responsible for setting up its own system of government, and what we see is that all 50 states have pretty much modeled the federal government almost exactly. Three branches of government: an executive branch led by the governor, a legislative branch that makes the laws called the state legislature, and of course the judicial branch, which is the state court system. And the third category is called concurrent powers, and these are powers that the state has that are similar to what the federal government has to do on a nationwide basis, and that would include collecting taxes and regulating commerce within the state. So looking at a little bit more detail here: police power, states responsible for their own criminal codes, health and safety and labor regulations. Home rule, states are responsible for setting up their own governments. And then, of course, concurrent powers include regulating their state commerce, taxing. Some states have their own income taxes, obviously sales taxes and property taxes and things like that. The states have their own banks that they can charter, corporations that they can grant licenses to. They also will have to define property rights in their state, and the states also have their own power of eminent domain, which is where they could take property as long as it has just compensation. So the 10th Amendment, very important, last one of the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment, also called the Reserved Powers, that delegates everything else down to the states. Now, there's where your concurrent powers are also listed there as the overlap for the states. Now, for the last thing that I want to talk about as far as how the Constitution got sold to the states was this concept of the separation of powers. This is from the textbook, just a very general outline that the powers that the executive branch has over the judicial branch and vice versa. What I want to do is just go through those a little bit more clearly here. So, for example, what is the power that the executive branch has over Congress? Well, for one thing, the president can veto the bill. He can refuse to sign the bill that the Congress has put together. Well, vetoes are fairly rare as well because there's a lot of signaling going on. The president can put out signals that say that, well, if you give me that bill in that form, I'm not going to sign it. So therefore, the Congress would have to regroup. Now, perhaps the most important power that the president has is that He's the one that will implement the laws. And there's a lot of interpretation there that the executive branch may have to do, the bureaucracy may have to do in order to implement and enforce those laws that Congress has made. Now, what power does the president have over the courts? Well, he has the appointment power. He has the power to appoint all federal judges. Now, they're appointed for life, so therefore he only appoints when there's a vacancy. Somebody may die or step down, resign, whatever. And he also has the power to pardon people from crimes. And this is a controversial power that the president has that would overrule the courts. Somebody convicted of a federal crime could be pardoned, and presidents could perhaps abuse that power. What power does the Congress have over the president? Well, we've already talked about how the Congress can override the president's veto with 2/3 vote in both houses. They also have the power of impeachment, where the House makes the charges, serves the indictment, and then the trial is held in the Senate. The Senate has the power to approve the appointments of the executive branch. Those are approved by majority vote. If they don't like somebody who's been nominated by the president, they can reject that appointment, send out signals. And a very important inferred power is the power of oversight, where they have to keep an eye on the executive branch. They have the power to subpoena witnesses, and they can call people into congressional hearings there and try to investigate something that went wrong that the executive branch did, or money was wasted, or somebody got injured or killed through some program. And so the Congress has the power of investigative oversight of the executive branch. They also have some powers over the courts, to where we've already talked about that it's a Congress that actually determines the size of the court. They could go in tomorrow and actually change the number of Supreme Court justices. We have 9. It's been 9 for over 100 years. There's no reason to change that, but technically Congress could go in there if they were motivated to do so and change the structure of the court system. Congress, of course, passes the laws and amendments, and regardless of what the Supreme Court may rule on something, Congress could go in the very next day and pass a new law which completely obliterates what the court had just ruled or interpreted. Again, they can also reject nominees to the Supreme Court or to any federal judgeship, and they also have the power, of course, to impeach a Supreme Court judge as well. What powers does the court have over the executive branch? Well, this concept of judicial review means that they can review a law, but yet declare an action that the president does, they can declare that unconstitutional. Very powerful thing that the Supreme Court can do. They can also issue warrants as far as what somebody may need in order to investigate the president's branch. The Supreme Court will, of course, preside over the impeachment trial in the Senate as well. Now, as far as the court's power over Congress, somewhat similar in that they, through this power of judicial review, if an issue is brought to them and it makes it all the way to the Supreme Court can strike down that law or strike down a portion of that law as unconstitutional. Very powerful part of what the Supreme Court can do. They've been using it more recently in the last few decades in order to perhaps legislate in the absence of what Congress may be not doing, and again, presiding over the Senate during the impeachment trial. So what we have here are a little bit more detail on the aspects of what sold the Constitution to the states. That's the separation of powers, of course, the Federalist Papers that help explain this representative government, and then the Bill of Rights, which put more restrictions on the use of federal government power.